Hi, I'm so happy to see you made it past the rules visit and have decided to join me for the more interesting part of the course. The skill of analysis that we will focus on this semester is a higher level thinking skill that can be applied to many topics and a skill that you will find yourself using throughout your life. Again, the more you practice this skill, the more effective thinker you will be. In this course, we will use literature as our topic for analysis as it provides a rich source of ideas. Literature is actually made up of systems and processes. Learning how to analyze means to take apart, examine, and understand the topic in a new way. This skill can be applied in other intellectual pursuits. While some students may dislike literature because of its fictional label, I think you will begin to see that although the names of characters, locations, and specific events are fictional, the themes and the stories themselves actually relate to concerns that all of us have and live with daily. Also, literature validates the human condition. Literature represents man's deepest emotional and intellectual experiences expressed in language. In fact, one purpose for reading literature is to validate your own persona and value as a human being. Really good short stories treat universal problems that all humans face. Also, a good short story can open new doors of imagination and experience that will enrich your understanding of mankind. Even though you may not think of yourself as a reader, everyone enjoys stories, and this first part of the course gives you an opportunity to read a dozen short stories that may end up changing your life. At the very least, I'm sure you will find one that relates to your own life experience. As we begin to talk about the short story, I want to give you a few definitions of some terms you can use in discussing literature. By the way, you can expect to see these terms used in the midterm exam. Also, if you've not already read A&P or viewed the theatrical version on the DVD, you might want to do so before going further. Knowing something about the story will help you understand the examples more clearly. One word you need to be familiar with as we begin our study of literature is the word genre. This word genre means type. Thus, in literature, we will study the short story genre, the poetry genre, and the drama genre. In discussing character, we're discussing the inner self that determines speech and behavior. Usually in writing, this will refer to various character traits of an individual. For example, when you read the story A&P, you may come to some conclusions about the character of the protagonist, Sammy. The author tells the reader what Sammy thinks and does, but he does not tell the reader what Sammy's character traits are. You examine Sammy's behavior and come to some analytic conclusions of your own, such as thinking that Sammy is impulsive or maybe intolerant. The protagonist is the character we may think of as the hero or the central figure of a story, while the antagonist is a figure of opposition to the protagonist and is sometimes the villain or the bad guy. The protagonist usually goes through a character change. The story Fleur that you will read this semester is really about a character named Pauline, who is the central figure of the story. Pauline is the protagonist. This story shows how Pauline changes in response to the antagonist, who is the character Fleur, for which the story is named. In A&P, Sammy, the young store clerk, is the protagonist, while Mr. Lingle, the store manager, is the antagonist. Setting involves the time, place, and other environmental factors that affect the story. In A&P, for example, the time is the late 50s or early 60s. The reader knows this by paying attention to details in the story. The mention of the Cold War and fear of Russians invading the U.S. is a tip to the time in which the story takes place. In A&P, the immediate location is the A&P grocery store, but the wider location of conservative small town north of Boston and 5 miles from the beach is very important to the theme of the story. The element of the setting helps to establish the liberal-conservative dichotomy of the story conflict. Always be alert to the details of setting and the way in which they affect the bigger picture. Other important details in A&P include Sammy's apron and bow tie as a symbol of the conservative nature of his environment. plot involves the plan or groundwork of incidents that make up a story. Many stories follow a traditional plot structure, beginning with an exposition that introduces the main characters, the setting, and the primary conflict of a story. This is followed by a rising action segment of the story where the tension of the conflict begins to increase and reaches a crisis level. The climax is reached as the tension of the conflict breaks and the crisis explodes. The climax is followed by a denouement or resolution where the conflict and problems of the story are resolved. This kind of plot structure can be seen in A&P, where the exposition or introduction of the character, setting, and conflict can be seen through paragraph 11. The rising action continues as the conflict rises with Sammy's reaction to the girls in swimsuits and builds to the crisis of Lingle confronting the girls. This is followed by the climax when Sammy quits his job and the denouement of his realization about his future. Point of view refers to the perspective of the storyteller. An omniscient point of view means that a narrator is a voice outside the story who can see into the minds of all characters. On the other hand, a first-person participant point of view is the voice of a character in the story who can only give story details from his own perspective and does not know the minds of other characters. A first-person point of view can make a story seem more immediate, almost as if the character sat down and told a story directly to you. A&P is told from the first-person point of view as Sammy relates only what he thinks, says, and does from his own perspective. The theme of a story is always the message of the story or the central idea that the author is trying to communicate. It is an abstract idea stated in general terms without mentioning characters or specifics of the story. Many pieces of literature have more than one theme, and any single theme can be expressed in a variety of ways. A&P is a good example. One student might say this story expresses a theme of loss of innocence, or what is sometimes called an initiation theme. Another student might see the theme of this story as one of rebellion against the establishment. Someone else might say that A&P develops a theme of youthful idealism versus establishment values. All of these are valid statements of theme in this story and can be clearly supported with details and evidence from the story itself. I will discuss theme in more detail later in today's visit by looking at all of the assigned stories for this semester. Tone refers to the attitude of the author toward the material of the story. Is his attitude comic or humorous? Is it depressing, sympathetic, complaining? In A&P, one might say that Updike uses a tone of naivety or innocence. A symbol is a concrete object that represents an idea, a value, a persona, a way of life, but usually something abstract. When Sammy slams down his apron and bow tie, one can say he is making a symbolic gesture. He is rejecting the symbol of the establishment represented by the uniform of the store. Style in a story is the unique arrangement of language used to tell a story. In the case of A&P, the style includes slang and many creative metaphors and similes. Most authors have a specific way of arranging language that is associated with all of their writing. The premise of a story is a brief statement of the major conflict on which the story is based. Unlike a theme statement, a premise may include specific characters and events. For example, if explaining the premise of A&P, a student might say, in A&P, John Updike tells the story of a young grocery store clerk who defies authority to defend 3 inappropriately dressed teenage girls. Now that we've covered some of the basics, I want to go directly to a discussion of the 12 stories you will read this semester and the themes on which they are based. Remember, the theme of the story is the central or dominant idea. It is the author's message to you about life. A literary work can explore any theme, and as mentioned before, the theme may be stated in a variety of ways, but some common themes that occur over and over again are referred to as conventional themes. We will look at 4 of these conventional themes this semester. The first theme we will examine is the theme of initiation. This is also referred to as loss of innocence, coming of age, or rite of passage. This kind of theme reveals a character in the process of growing up and the way in which this process is disillusioning and painful. The group of initiation stories includes A&P by John Updike, The Secret Lion by Alberto Rios, and Araby by James Joyce. As you have probably already learned, Sammy's rite of passage in A&P involves turning his back on the conventional values of his parents, co-workers, and his employer to venture into a more different, more liberal world where he is independent. He must be willing to accept the consequences of his independent decision. In The Secret Lion, Alberto Rios tells the story of two young boys who are moving into puberty as they begin junior high school. Rios shows how the boys begin to lose their innocence through their relationships to teachers, female classmates, their parents, and finally the community at large. The innocent perspective as children is torn away from them in brutal encounters with adult reality. James Joyce's Araby depicts another young teenager as he experiences his first idealistic infatuation with a neighbor's older sister. When his attentions are not returned as he desires, he begins to realize that he's not really equipped to conduct a romantic relationship. And the final words of the story reveal his anguish and anger upon losing his youthful idealism and facing adult reality. Feminine powerlessness. This kind of theme explores the experience of female protagonists who are usually in a position of weakness within the general scheme of society. These characters are attempting to exert power over their own destinies, but face various obstacles in the process. Assigned stories that explore the issue of feminine powerlessness include Fleur by Louise Erdrich, Boys and Girls by Alice Munro, and Everyday Use by Alice Walker. The story of Fleur by Louise Erdrich is really about a young girl named Pauline. She's a Native American who is torn away from her Chippewa tribe along with her mother by an Anglo man. When her mother dies, Pauline is made to work in a butcher shop and give all of her income to her stepfather, Dutch. She feels invisible and completely powerless until Fleur, a very strong Chippewa woman, comes into her life. Pauline admires Fleur and attempts to learn from her how to become a strong woman as well. The crisis of the story occurs when Pauline fails to help Fleur as a group of men abduct and rape her. However, Pauline is able to rise above her fear and later commit an act of bravery that punishes the men involved. You can easily see how this story explores the theme of feminine experience of powerlessness. Another story, Boys and Girls by Alice Munro, demonstrates how in most cultures women, even as small girls, are expected to fill a role that is quite different from men or boys. Throughout this story, a young girl who lives on a fox farm tries to prove to her father she is capable of helping him in his work, while her mother tries to restrict her to household duties. In her bravery and desire to be given the respect given to boys, she tries to be a part of the male activities. But when a moment of compassion causes her to release a wounded animal to spare it from death, she ends up sealing her fate as a woman when her father condescendingly says, "She's only a girl." Finally, Everyday Use by Alice Walker is another story that examines the various roles of women and their relationship to family heritage. The story is available in a film theatrical version on one of the DVDs. This story tells about Mama and the destinies of her two daughters. This African-American family has been separated because of the decision of one of the daughters to become a better educated and more independent woman in a world away from her rural upbringing. Dee has begun to explore her African heritage, but only in a very superficial way. Meanwhile, Mama and Maggie cling to the traditional roles of women in the home, truly connected to family heritage through objects and names created by ancestors. Dee wants the objects to show off in her city dwelling, rather than as a reminder of her family. Walker reaffirms the traditional point of view through Mama and Maggie. Another conventional theme revolving around parenting conflicts involves the ambivalence experienced by parents in relationship to their children. Sometimes this is exhibited by rebellion of a child against a parent or regrets a parent may have about how he's reared his child. Parenting conflict stories include Two Kinds by Amy Tan, Teenage Wasteland by Ann Tyler, and I Stand Here Ironing by Tilly Olson. Amy Tan's Two Kinds is the story of an Asian American mother whose expectations of her daughter exceed what the daughter is willing to give. The mother wants her child to be a child prodigy and forces her into all kinds of activities in order to achieve that goal. She claims that there are only two kinds of daughters, obedient and disobedient. The daughter, Jing Mei, on the other hand, only wants to be herself and does not really want to excel in any of the areas chosen by her mother. The conflict between the two begins when Jing Mei is very young and it escalates into a bitter controversy. It is not until after her mother's death that Jing Mei is able to reconcile her resentment of her mother's attempts to help her achieve her best. In Teenage Wasteland, Ann Tyler presents a mother struggling with a rebellious teenage boy, Donnie, who seems destined to waste his life completely. While Donnie thinks his mother is controlling, the mother wants only to show her love to her son and to raise him perfectly as she sees it. The mother follows the advice of the school principal, a counselor, and a tutor, but to no avail. When the boy is finally expelled from school and disappears as a suspected runaway, the mother is left wondering where she failed. Finally, I Stand Here Ironing by Tilly Olson is another of the film stories available on your DVDs. The story, told in first person, relates the regrets and remorse of a mother who was forced by circumstances to make decisions that ended up alienating her oldest daughter from her. A broken marriage, limited funds, a child's poor health are some of the circumstances. As the mother stands ironing, she agonizes over the lack of affection shared with her daughter and the might have been if she had made better parenting decisions. Themes of aging usually involve facing death or attempting to live in a meaningful way after being weakened by health problems and aging. These stories usually affirm the dignity and nobility of older characters. Stories about coping with aging include A Worn Path by Eudora Welty, Cathedral by Raymond Carver, and A Clean, Well-Lighted Place by Ernest Hemingway. Eudora Welty's A Worn Path is another one of the film stories on your DVDs. This story of Phoenix Jackson relates the saga of an aging, impoverished African-American woman who is devoted to her invalid grandson and makes regular long treks into town to obtain his necessary medication. The woman is determined to overcome any obstacle in her path and lets nothing interfere with her goal. Her resourcefulness and perseverance reveal a noble spirit. Cathedral by Raymond Carver can also be found as a film story on the DVDs. Carver relates the story of a couple and an elderly blind man who knew the wife previously and comes to visit. The story centers on ways of knowing through the senses and on ways of communicating when an individual has lost his sense of vision. Although the protagonist is the younger man, the husband, it is the older blind man who teaches him a better way to live and helps him to improve his relationship with his wife. Finally, Ernest Hemingway's Clean, Well-Lighted Place is a story of an elderly man who is both blind and deaf. He feels he has nothing to live for, but continues to visit a cafe he finds to be both clean and well-lit. Like the elderly man in Cathedral, this character becomes a catalyst for the two young waiters to learn how to face life with grace, dignity, and style. Now that I've given you a summary of the stories you will be reading, I want to give you a few more tips on analysis. Remember that literary analysis involves a process of examining a text and coming to an independent conclusion about the abstract ideas portrayed by the author that can be proven by using examples from the story. Literary analysis is not a summary, a retelling of the story, or a chronological list of quotes or events that follow the storyline. When you write your short story essay, you will be doing a character analysis. This means you need to pay particular attention to the protagonist of the story, and you should be asking yourself these questions. What are his character traits? What does he do? Why does he do what he does? How does his character change? And how does his character relate to the theme of the story? Make as many notes as possible answering these questions before you actually start organizing your essay. Remember that your author will not tell you explicitly what the theme is or what character traits the hero possesses. You must analyze what the character thinks, says, and does to come up with your own conclusions. If you were to take the story A and P, for example, you might make a long list of traits that describe Sammy, such as arrogant, intolerant, immature, impulsive, chauvinistic, rebellious, naive, or even others. Keep this list handy as you will eventually narrow it down to the 3 strongest traits. In determining what motivates Sammy, you might conclude that the boredom he experiences working in the store is a prime motivation for seeking a different experience. Or you might say his interest in young women is a motivation to take action. His character obviously changes from acceptance of his situation in life to one of rebellion and independence. And finally, since you know the theme is one of initiation, think about the reality he faces as a result of his loss of innocence. These questions should help you get started on analyzing one of the stories in preparation for the short story essay that will be discussed in our visit number 4. You may choose any of the stories except for A and P, and you should choose one that you really connect with personally. In our next visit, I will show you exactly how to go about organizing and drafting your essay. Until we meet again, goodbye for now.